I'm Lauren Borchardt, Director of Historical Programs here at the U.S. Capitol Historical Society. We're delighted to welcome you today to the second edition of Lunch Bites with Steve and Jane. Today they'll be speaking about Frederick Law Olmsted and his plans for the Capitol grounds.
Thank you, Lauren, and thank you. I want to say for all the members and friends of the Society, we owe a special debt to Lauren, who learned Zoom webinar technology instantly as we moved into the virtual reality world of working from home. And so one of the things that the Historical Society does that we hold dear is our historical tours of the Capitol itself and the Capitol grounds. And we are gifted with an extraordinary tour guide. Steve Livengood has been doing tours of the Capitol for 50 years. And when I first came on as the president about a little bit more than a year ago, I said, I'd like to go on one of your tours. And he said, well, would you like the 10-hour version or would you like a shorter version? I opted for a shorter version, but I've been doing several different tours. And this man has an extraordinary knowledge of the Capitol itself, the grounds of the Capitol, the stories behind the development of the Capitol, and more importantly, what the Capitol means as a symbol of American democracy with all of its challenges. So we decided that during the time that people were working from home, that the Capitol was still very much the symbol of democracy. Nightly on the news, you hear what the Congress is doing or trying to do. And so we thought the way to kind of bring it to you is to do a little bit of sort of virtual tours of the grounds themselves. How did the Capitol become where it is? How did the design happen? How did the grounds happen? Which is what today's conversation is. Frederick Law Olmsted really is the father of American landscape architecture, probably internationally the father of landscape architecture. And he was the principal person who helped to design the grounds of the Capitol. And so I will now turn the show over to Steve. Steve has an excellent set of slides that he has taken. The good news is he lives in the Capitol Hill neighborhood. So when he goes on his exercise walk, he took his camera the last week and has documented the visions, and so that you can have a virtual tour with him. As Lauren said, we invite you to put questions into the question and answer box during the conversation. And Steve and I will have conversation during the time if we begin to see questions. So that being said, Steve, tell us about Frederick Law Olmsted.
Good morning. I guess afternoon already, isn't it? Anyway, this is the plan that Olmsted submitted to the Capitol. What had happened, the reason why it was submitted was that they had expanded the building, and you can see in the center of the view here is the footprint of the Capitol with two extensions on each end. Those extensions had just been finished, and the Capitol grounds had not gone any further than a square centered on that on the smaller building. So just to give you an idea of the elements of the plan itself, around the outside, you can see the trees are heavy all the way around the square, sort of defining the square. And then as you get closer and closer to the Capitol building, the trees get thinner and thinner. So that's the first major element. Then he was dealing basically with two separate landscapes. The one at the top of the plan is the east front, and it's fairly level. And he created these two egg-shaped structures that you can see on the map there. And the reason for that is that the square had 21 streets coming in and 46 separate entrances. And he wanted to gently move people to a more limited number of entrances at the building itself. And so he did that by making these gently bending walks that brought together several different entrances. And you can see from the outside the walkways and so forth gather on those egg-shaped structures. So those are the ovals. But on the other side, what is below the Capitol on this map is a great circle, and it includes 3 open lawns at the bottom with the 2 circles at the bottom that are traffic circles, and then these gentle circles, which are done again to gather all of the streets and the walkways, but also to get people, to steer people to the east front of the building, because there's no entrance on the west front. And so you have to steer people around and get them to go up the hill, and by making it circular like that, it's a more gentle rise in the hill. So we're going to explore those different elements. So this is the plan, and here I'm comparing it to the previous plan. On the right is Thomas Walter's plan for the same area, and you can see it differs significantly, particularly in that it does not identify the trees. Olmsted himself is very, very associated with trees, and one of the interesting things about this plan that makes it different than any other Olmsted plan is that in places like Central Park, and of course Central Park in New York City is what he is most famous for, but that and Prospect Park and major parks in most of the big cities of the country, he's trying to help you forget the fact that you're in the middle of a city and put you out in the wilderness with as few structures as possible. In this case, he is trying to use the wilderness to emphasize the building. And this is really the only plan that he ever did that had that purpose. So it makes it fundamentally different. But you can see he's trying to introduce as many trees as he can, but use the trees to emphasize the building. The Walter plan was mostly open space and green and not really very well, certainly not very subtly articulated. Now we can compare it with what exists now. You can see the trees around the outside of the grounds. The one unfortunate situation now is that you can see on the 2 walkways that are right in front in this photograph, you don't see the trees very well. That's because they're all new at the time the photograph was taken. And in fact, the trees that are in the photograph have all been replaced with the trees that are small also. That had a lot of trouble with the trees surviving in the urban atmosphere and so forth. And so they've had to replant them. But the idea will be that they still want to get back to this tree-lined alley in the future. And Steve, so they've planted the trees again. Yes.
Steve, one of the questions that people are asking is the map that we have that you're showing of yes. the plan. What year is that map from?
Yeah, thanks. So it's coming right after the Civil War. They have finished the construction of those 2 extensions on the Capitol. And once those were finished, then they were ready to address the issue of the grounds. And at that point, there were 2 large blocks of buildings that they tore down. They are in the 2 upper corners of the map as you see it now. And so that Capitol grounds were extended in that way. And if we go back to the Walter plan, you can see that he had this circular drive going around, and they took in other parts of it as well. That's the situation, is that we've got the Civil War over with, and they're ready to go back to building more permanent things in Washington, D.C. Now here I went over to the Library of Congress and stood up on the terrace that's one of the highest points around there, so you can see. And what I'm showing you is those oval structures that I talked about. you can see right in front of us in two different angles here are these oval structures that are defined by a very low wall, but you can see the trees around the outside and then none, just a few up close to the Capitol. Now here I want to show the wall up close. This is one of the corners, and you can see there are three different walls here. One of them you can't see as well, it's in the middle, but on the left you can see a wall of 2 rows of stone, and then the wall further behind but straight ahead has 4. And I did this close-up of the wall with the 4 to show you that the 2 lower ones are the Olmsted ones. The 2 lower layers are much older. That would be from the 1870s. But the wall was not high enough for the security barricade that they needed to put up after 9/11. And so they have doubled the height of the wall by adding 2 more layers, but they've tried to make it just as close to the Olmsted design as they can by just adding those 2 rows of stones at the top. Now between the 2 is a wall that starts, and it looks like this. This is confusing because I've switched back to the other side of the building. But on the right here, you can see is the low wall. But on the left, the wall starts and curves around and starts getting higher and higher. So the shot on the right is taken down at the lowest end of the photograph on the left. You can see it gets higher and higher, and it has a real resemblance to entering a castle moat. And so now they're growing these vines crawling up over it, so at least you won't have the sense of a defensive construction here. And here on the right, you can see an area along Constitution Avenue down at the bottom of the hill. And again, they're repeating this same wall. It's got that gentle curve in the front, right here in front, but that same wall goes all the way around the building. And its design was really, really low on purpose, because he doesn't want to interfere with your experience of the greenery, but he doesn't want you walking on the grass. So rather than put up "keep off the grass" signs, he makes the wall just high enough that you don't want to have to climb over it. So this is Olmsted's subtle way of telling you to keep off the grass without actually forcing you to keep off the grass. No sense, not nearly as much of a sense of a barricade. Now we get into some of the street furniture. This is the rainbow fountain at the east front. It's turned off in this photograph because it sits on top of the visitor center, and they're still having problems with leaks. So I've not seen it actually running in probably a year. So I don't know what they're going to do with it. They do plant cannas in it, so there probably will be huge lilies growing out of it this year, but it's whether it'll actually operate or not, I don't know. But I did come upon this historic photograph of it on the right. You can see there are 2 of them, and this is what it looked like at one point. He had installed gas lights underneath it that shone up on it and tried to make a rainbow out of that spray of water. It was really quite innovative, but they've tried to make them work again, and they don't. And so I'm not sure what they're going to do with them now, but they have preserved this wonderful Olmsted element. The base of it is a wonderful red stone that recurs throughout. In the black and white photograph, that lamp post that you can see there is made out of that red stone. And that, again, is one of the themes that Olmsted used. Here's another one. This is the wall of the oval shape on the Capitol side, and he has made a bench out of it. Again, he's telling you to keep off the grass, not making it intrusive. And he knew that the bench might be hot, and so he's put holes through the stone in the back there to keep your the air circulating around your back as you're sitting there. But what he did was to figure out the point at which you would not be looking at the Capitol along this oval if you sat there, and he stops the bench at that point, and that would be off to the right. But there's this wonderful bench where when I'm giving tours around, I can have 20 or 30 people sitting in a row on this bench and talk to them about the Capitol building, and the building is right behind me. On the left here is the view that you see from that location as you're sitting there, and the idea was that here you would be looking right at the Capitol building, but you can see the red, white, and blue pattern that he put in the pavement here. This and the lamppost and all the more delicate decorations are actually the work of a man who worked for Olmsted named Thomas Wisedell. And Wisedell liked this kind of pattern, and you can always tell something was made by Wisedell by this. At that time, it was very fashionable to use Chinese elements in your designs, and so we'll see some of these rather strange-looking Chinese designs in the Capitol grounds in the work of Wisedell. Now this is the way we have adapted to the wall. This occurs behind the wall that you just saw, and you can see the top of the wall there and the pavement beyond it with that red, white, and blue pattern. But this is an area that's used for outdoor press conferences and television, and they have installed permanent connections so that they can just plug the television cameras in here, and you can see some of them are identified by the network that can plug in right at that point. But that shows you how they're still adapting Olmsted's plan, and it is easily used for things like this, where you can conceal what is kind of an ugly, dissonant element behind what Olmsted has.
Hey, Steve, one of the questioners asked, whatever happened with the gas lights that were part of the fountain that you showed us a couple slides ago?
Well, they're gone, of course. There was a gas explosion in the Capitol in about year 1900, and they took out all of the gas at that point and switched to electricity. So they're gone. I don't know how well they work. There are a number of things in Olmsted's plan that just didn't work, and my guess is that was one of them. This is looking toward the oval and looking across at the Capitol building. This was a streetcar stop, and you can see it's beautifully designed. It's got wisteria growing over it now, and in a few weeks the huge blossoms will be hanging from the top here, and it makes a very pleasant place to stop along the Capitol grounds. But if you notice, he has divided the benches. There are armrests connecting connected to the base there, and dividing up each of those sections into 3, and that was to keep people from laying down there. He wants to make sure that you keep yourself focused on the Capitol building and not taking a nap, and so that also is an Olmsted element. And then he has positioned the bench itself so that you're looking at the Capitol building straight ahead there. So it's not on the square with the cardinal directions. It is oriented clearly to the building itself, and he's telling you what he wants you looking at while you're sitting there waiting on your streetcar. There's one of these on each side at the top of the Capitol there. Now,
Steve, as you go back into the plan, how long did it take for the plan to get implemented? Did Frederick Law Olmsted get to see it come to fruition, or is that something that was past his time?
He was hired in 1867. The last elements were done in the 1890s. So he did in fact oversee most of the construction of the last element, which was the biggest one, the terraces on the west front. So he was able to see it, but he also knew that it would take decades for those trees to grow in. And so he did not get to see the fulfillment of the plan, but he was able to see the whole thing implemented. But it was passed in parts. They didn't get around to passing the appropriation for those terraces until just before they were built. So it was always insecure as to whether it was actually going to get built as he thought it ought to be.
And somebody who's a true Washingtonian asked, where you showed the camera boxes, is that the triangle or the swamp?
It's called the swamp, which is next to the triangle. The triangle is the thing that you were looking at as you were sitting in the bench. But the connections are there for the swamp. The reason why it's called the swamp is that it was used so much that they trampled all the grass, and it was always and it was a hard surface underneath of compressed soil, and so it was always it didn't drain well. It was always wet, so they paved it now with stones that they're permeable, so they allow the water to get through. But they've had to pave it over because it's used so much. So that it's referred to as the swamp, but it's no longer swampy. They've taken care of that issue.
And one of the other questions, several folks have asked it, when did the trolleys stop going on Capitol grounds?
As far as I know, the trolleys continued until, was it 1963 or 62 or something, when they stopped in Washington.
In Washington.
Yeah, it's a whole story about a transit strike, and one of the conditions to bailing out the transit company was that they end the trolley service because it was too disruptive in the traffic in Washington.
And we obviously have somebody who's quite knowledgeable, Joe Wysiak, who's telling us that in the Senate trolley stop, you can see where the gas lamps were located, and that the east front fountains have been controlled by the architect of the Capitol with just a controlled height of the spray. So they've been working on that issue.
Yes, Joe is a very well-known Capitol guide who's having to sit at home and not get to give tours of the Capitol himself.
So he is joining in
quite.
The conversation. So thank you, Joe. We appreciate that. Okay, back to Steve. Tell us where we are.
Now we're around on the west front, looking the other way. You can see we've got Washington Monument in the middle, and what I've done is to show kind of a panorama of the three sweeping lawns that you saw at the bottom of the map. And then at the bottom, you can see a view looking back toward the Capitol across the central lawn there. You can see the wall where it starts, which is down by the circles. And it happens that group in the middle is an Olmsted tour of one of our volunteers walking a group around. But that gives you a sense of the sweeping view that you have from both sides of that central element there. So here you have a panorama of the three elements on the west front. And separating the three are these wonderful paved paths. Again, you've got the red, white, and blue stone pattern, recognizably Wysdale's work, and the street lamps, and all of those are historic and date from the plan itself. But this is how this is what those avenues look like. What you see straight ahead in the photograph is Pennsylvania Avenue, and they just extended it as a walkway up to the Capitol. This is where it starts, and what we're going to do is to walk along that curved walkway. You have these wonderful elements. These are some of the Chinese design elements that I was talking about that are recognizably Thomas Weisdel's work. You can see the low stone wall by which you would approach the curved walkway, and then this this lamp designating the boundary of entering as a gateway to the Capitol grounds, and that would originally have been a gas light. This is what it looks like from up above, looking back toward what you just saw. As you go up, you're beginning to look through the trees and see glimpses of the Capitol itself. Then all of a sudden you come out to a view. Olmsted picked particular angles of the Capitol that he thought were aesthetically the most pleasing. You see on the right here is the House chamber. That's the extension that you saw on the plan. You can tell here that's marble, and the marble's just been refurbished. It's now a bright gray color, whereas the older part of the building on the left, the dome is painted cast iron, and the building itself is painted sandstone. And that's why the difference in color. But that's the old part of the building on the left with the flag and the new part. And so this is where, as I'm bringing groups up from the bottom of the hill, I stop here and because everybody wants to stop and take photographs, and so I do, and I spend a few minutes talking about Olmsted and his influence on the Capitol grounds and the experience that he wanted you to have. But then he takes you back. This is where you continue walking, and he takes you back into the woods, so that you have this sense of starting with the wilderness and the heavy trees, and slowly you glimpse this building, and then you get a big view of it, and then you go back into the wilderness as you climb the hill. And then you begin to see the building itself that you're going to be entering. So this is the end of the house wing. It's off to the right of the photograph that I showed you before. One of the things that Olmsted did, particularly in Central Park, but here in the Capitol grounds as well, is separating the pedestrians from the vehicles. Now, he was designing this before the automobile. These would have been carriages and horses and delivery wagons and so forth that would have been in the street, and certainly not these parking spaces that you see. But this gives you some sense as you're walking up the hill. We were walking up that walkway that's in the background on the right, and then, I'm sorry, on the right side of the left photograph. On the right photograph, you're standing at the far side of the left photograph and looking back toward the pavement. Olmsted's
Steve, there are a couple questions from the last. The other question people had about the trolley stops is there were some folks that thought that there were similar kind of trolley stops around the Senate buildings. Were those inspired by Olmsted as well, or is that just the trolley?
Well, the Senate buildings were not there when Olmsted was working, but all around the enlarged Capitol grounds now, there are all sorts of elements that echo Olmsted's work. For instance, the Library of Congress, which wasn't built until after Olmsted, has those same low walls. So you can tell these are elements copied from Olmsted.
Great. And when Olmsted was working, the mall, did it look anything like what we know the mall? Or
it did not.
Yeah,
it did not. The mall is on L'Enfant's plan from the very beginning, but it was rejected immediately by the commissioners. They couldn't afford to waste all that space, and so they gave away that space to government departments. So what went on the mall was the railroad station and a lot of other, and the zoo was in the middle of the mall and so forth. And Olmsted saw saw that, and he asked the Congress to let him redesign the mall, and they said, no, you stick to the Capitol grounds. So Olmsted told his son, whom we know as Rick Olmsted, Frederick Law Olmsted Jr., he told his son what ought to be in Washington, and eventually, after 1900, when we had the centennial and replanned the city, the son carried out what his father had intended. So in fact, the mall as we know it now was finally finished in the 1930s, although it was in a different way on L'Enfant's plan from the beginning. That shows you how inspiring L'Enfant's plan was, that it took them more than 100 years to implement it, but it became the basis of the recreation of Washington that took place after 1900.
And can you say a little bit about how the creation of the Capitol Visitor Center sort of preserved, or the Olmsted plan, how, you showed the going down, but I'm sure that was quite a conversation.
Yes, in fact, I had meant to say something about that when I showed you the ovals, because in creating the Capitol Visitor Center, of course, the ovals limited the space that they could excavate, but they chose to keep the ovals and use that to limit the space that they had in the visitor center. And that curve that I showed you as walking down where they're growing the vines up over the stone, that is to define that oval and to keep as much as they could of the Olmsted plan. Really, when you look at the details of what they did with the visitor center, it's really rather inspiring that they were able to essentially double the size of the Capitol building and still maintain the feel of the Olmsted plan. It's quite brilliant. What we have here is the photograph of the terraces that Olmsted built. This is the last part of his plan. You can see the Capitol building itself, and the grounds came all the way up to the building. The dome, particularly from the west side, seemed oversized, and Olmsted thought that it looked like it was going to slide down the hill, that it was awkward, and that the building needed more base to appear more solid. And so he designed this marble terrace that now surrounds 3 of the 4 sides of the Capitol building with these magnificent staircases. And the unfortunate thing is that there's no entrance on this side of the building. As you approach it from the mall, you then have to walk all the way around the building to get to the top, and that's what that circular drive was about. But he's mitigating the aesthetics of the situation by putting this the staircases there and the terraces. Unfortunately, for security reasons, you can't get up on the terraces anymore, and so you don't see the view. I remember standing up there at the bicentennial and watching the fireworks show in what's about the center of the terrace here. But you can't get up there anymore, unfortunately, because they would have to have guards all over the place and gets the public too close to the building on that side. But this is the last element, and it's the one that the Congress was most reluctant to do, to fund, but finally they did. And now it contains a lot of the hideaway offices that the senators get, and a lot of other sort of service elements for the building. But the terrace is there, and at least it provides this aesthetic base for the Capitol building from the west side. This is a photograph of one of the signs on the Capitol grounds, indicating that in fact Olmsted gets a lot of credit nowadays. The Capitol has made it clear what he has done, and that photograph that I just showed you is the one on the left here. So there's explanations all over the Capitol grounds giving Olmsted credit for the masterpiece that he had. This is up closer to the terrace and shows you the landscaping that he had in mind. He wanted you to be able to see the terrace and just have these low plants. The ones that I'm showing here are new. They cut down a bunch of trees that had overgrown and got them back to the scale that Olmsted wanted when he designed it. This is one of the grand staircases. The plastic covering that you see on the right is where they're restoring the marble to get ready for the inauguration. They'll have to take down all that plastic by the time that inauguration happens in January. But this is what it looks like now. Unfortunately, you're not allowed to go up on the terrace and not allowed to use the staircase anymore. But this is part of that Olmsted's magnificent terrace there on the west front. Here you can see the house side again. You can see the low plantings. These are the new ones that they've just put in. And here you can see what it looked like before. The terrace is hidden by these overgrown plants. Some of these, I think, are magnolias. And so little by little, they are restoring the plantings around the terrace to emphasize the terrace instead of hiding it. These are just some of Wysdell's designs. On the left, you can see this is down at the lowest part on the west front. What he's done is to carve what looks like an old cane of a rose bush, and the metal fasteners that would have held the rose bush up against a stone in a garden. Unfortunately, the stone has not held up very well. You can see the big cracks in it at the top, but this is the kind of delicate carving, and you can see again one of those former gas lanterns of Wysdell's design on the left. The one on the right is the one that's often compared with the Ark of the Covenant, but both of them you can see the design element, but in fact they predate China, predate Christianity in China. At the bottom, you can see this is again the beginning of that curved walkway, and these intricate elements are used to define the beginning of the Capitol grounds there as kind of a welcome. Then we get to the Olmsted masterpiece, the Spring Grotto. It's kind of hidden this way, but if you get up close, this is what it looks like inside. This is all Chinese design from the terracotta roof there, the tile roof. There's a fountain in the center. The fountain's turned off at the moment, so but it will be on shortly once the Capitol grounds are opened again, and it'll play in the middle there and make a wonderful place, a spot of respite, sort of halfway up the Capitol grounds. And this is what I call the hidden jewel of the Capitol grounds. This is one of the stone screens. That's a very Chinese element. You can see that he has put the armrests across the benches there so that people can't use them for laying down. They have to sit up and appreciate. But in the back of this, you can see in the upper right there, you can see an iron screen, and behind that is a grotto. You can't see it from up above or around it, but it is kind of the focus of this. And looking through there, there's a little waterfall of piped water, and it makes a very nice sound and a wonderful feel. Particularly on a hot summer day, you can go in there, and it's probably 20 to 30 degrees cooler in there. There originally were more trees overhanging it. You can see in the photograph in the middle and the lower part is a tree that had replaced one that fell over in a storm. They took a cutting from it and are growing it back. And the same thing with the tree in the upper left. Shortly, those trees will overhang the grotto and add to the whole experience of it. Olmsted labeled the trees. He actually designed the label that you see here, and this is his favorite type of tree. It's called a Japanese pagoda tree. Up on the right, you can see some of the leaves that have opened already, but this whole huge tree will have small leaves like that, and Olmsted liked that particular tree because it casts a dappled shadow. He is so intent on defining the experience that you have that he's even being concerned with the ways that the shadows of the trees are going to look. He's famous for designing landscapes as though they were paintings. He's making a real landscape painting out of the elements that he's showing here. But he's still educating you and put designs on there. So I'm sorry, put the labels on the trees so that you know what it is you're looking at. He also liked ginkgo trees, and he is the one that's responsible for the fact that so many cities in the eastern United States have a lot of ginkgo trees, and many of them would date to the period of his heyday, which is from the 1870s to the early 20th century.
Steve, we got a couple questions about the grotto. The cooling room is still, people were wondering, was that on the original plan, and is there a natural spring in that grotto, or how does that fountain work? They just had a few more questions about that.
Yes, okay. It is piped water. There may have been a natural spring there. There probably was at least a seep of some sort, but it wasn't enough water, and of course construction at the top of the hill messed up the natural flow of water there. So it was on the original plan, and in fact there were two of them. There's supposed to be one on the House side, but the House of Representatives didn't want to pay for something expensive and merely decorative like that. So there is none on the House side. It's only on the Senate side, but it was on the original plan. Another question?
Another question we had, Robert Sweet is calling in, and you know Robert, who's working on his book of Leadership by Design, and he had a couple questions. One is, he said he noticed in his research about Frederick Law Olmsted that the design of the Capitol was he then mirrored that when he did the design for the Utah State Capitol. Is that something that you have any information about?
I know that the two are linked on the internet in the galleries, and I could see a lot of elements in the photographs. I was not aware of the connection, but Olmsted quickly became famous, and there are thousands of landscapes that he and his firm designed, and they would have picked up elements from previous designs. And so I have no doubt of the connection with that, and with other state capitals as well.
That makes.
In fact, I might point out that the Capitol Dome is the first domed capitol in the United States. The Maryland State Capitol had a small dome, but it doesn't open to a huge room like this, like ours does, and like the National Capitol does. And after the Capitol Dome was built, 35 different states built new capitals with huge domes on them. So it was obvious that there was a lot of influence between the two, and I think probably the influence of the Capitol grounds was significant in a lot of states.
It might be a good moment just to acknowledge that we're coming up on the 200th anniversary of Olmsted, and the Olmsted 200 is working on having a grand celebration in 2022. Isn't that right?
Yes, yes. The National Association for Olmsted Parks is leading that celebration.
And, because we've had a couple people, write in saying, I know in Baltimore there's this kind of thing, and that National Association will identify all of the work, and of which it is really coast to coast. More than 500 commissions were done, and as you say, so many were modeled after it. But we're telling the story of the trees, because a lot of people had said, does Olmsted have a favorite tree? Did he say what tree he wants where? So tell us the tree stories.
Yes, he did specify the trees and the labels. I'm just showing you a little sample here. It turned out that the labels were causing problems on the trees themselves. Nailing the label, as the one on the left here is, allowed a protected area for insects to attack the tree. And so they've tried to deal with that over time. And on the right, you can see where the labels are now. This is a newer tree, and you can see the label stands out a long ways from the tree now to try to keep it from providing an opportunity for insects to get inside the tree. So that's why I showed this. Some of the Capitol trees are memorial trees. These are two recent ones. And you can tell because those are always brass plates. Olmsted would not have particularly approved of that because he did not want people thinking about the individual plants. He wanted them to think about the plants as a group, joining together, not really defined separately as a particular plant. So he's not thinking in terms of an arboretum where you emphasize particular plants. He's wanting you to think of a landscape, and that's how we separate what was called landscape gardening before Olmsted from the concept of landscape architecture. He's thinking in larger terms, and that's one of the things that he contributed to the whole philosophy is the concept of landscape architecture as a much larger element that you're trying to create and define. Here are the cherry trees that occur. Obviously, the blossoms are gone by now, but Olmsted would not have approved of that. He did not want flowering trees in the Capitol grounds because, again, a flowering tree calls attention to itself, and he's wanting you to focus your attention on the Capitol building. And so he would not have approved of the cherry blossoms, but they certainly are wonderful. If you can imagine the trees you see here, all covered in white with a kind of pinkish tone to them, they're just stunning. So ending up, this is the book from which much of this information comes, Genius of Place, The Life of Frederick Law Olmsted by Justin Martin. And I highly recommend that book as the best source for information about Frederick Law Olmsted and all of the things that he did and the concepts that he introduced in his life. So I can take questions if there are any, but that's the amount of information I was going to provide.
Steve, you've done a fabulous job. We said we were going to do a relatively short, but your knowledge is so extensive, and people were obviously interested because they were writing questions as we went along. And the only sort of remaining question is the question about Wisedale, who you mentioned a couple times. Was he a collaborator with Olmsted on other projects, or was it just the Capitol?
No, he worked for the Olmsted Company for a long time, and he has works all over the country. I'm not well acquainted with what else he did in the country, but no, he stayed with the Olmsted organization.
And if I could tell you the number of times people wrote in to say this is a fabulous, fabulous presentation and how much they're appreciative of this, it would take up the rest of the afternoon. But one quick question, someone specifically asked, you had the Emmett Till tree. Where is that located?
It is along Constitution Avenue. Below, it's sort of halfway up the hill, and is it's not the outer tree, but the first tree past, and it's right by one of the streets that comes onto the Capitol grounds that's blocked now, but it's there on the north side of the Capitol along Constitution Avenue.
And I think the sort of last question is a classic question. When the stay-in-place orders end, will we be able to take a tour with Steve?
I'm always available, particularly to generous contributors to the U.S. Capitol Historical Society.
And this is one of the features that we provide for members of the Capitol Historical Society. I'm hoping that this lunch lecture series, which we will be doing every Thursday during our lock-in period. Next week, Steve will be talking to us about creating Capitol Hill as a place. The Historical Society has actually written a book on that called Creating Capitol Hill. And so in the similar vein that we've learned about Frederick Law Olmsted, Steve will talk to us about the creation of Capitol Hill as a place and how that happened. So I hope you'll tune in next Thursday. We also have a more traditional, as Lauren said, more traditional lecture from our series by our very own Chuck G. Giacomantonio, our chief historian, who has written a book on the early days of our country. And this talk is going to be called Experience and Defeat, using letters from congressmen to explain the way the regime change from Adams' presidency to Jefferson's presidency shows how politicization, we may think is new, but it was very much part of the DC society even then, affecting even science, food, and social life. And Chuck will share with us Jefferson's obsession with mammoths. All of these things are available to register through the United States Capitol Historical Society website. And we also remind you that we bring this to you because we have such generous supporters who are our members and our donors. And so if you find these programs to be inspiring, we hope that you'll be inspired to become a member and supporter of the United States Historical Society, because our history is very rich, very full, and continues to be built every day. Thank you very much for joining us. We look forward to hearing from you and seeing you next week. Thank you, Steve, for your extraordinary leadership.